Welcome to A-Push. Today we're going to try to bring the war to a close and then really dive into the American Revolution and its aftermaths. So, here are your objectives. And we're going to go through rapid fire a series of battles. There's tons of videos online if you are interested in going and watching this in more depth, and of course, a lot of books that you could read. But for now, we're just going to give you the briefest of overviews. So, the beginning of the war, or the war continued with Washington fleeing from General Howe, who was trying to chase him down after the battle in New York. And so a series of running battles with Washington crossing the Hudson River and then fleeing south towards the Delaware River, with Howe only a day or two behind. Howe's goal, of course, was to capture and destroy Washington's army, meaning that the Americans would no longer have a regular army in the field, and Washington simply desperately needed to stay ahead of Howe. So when Washington got to the Delaware River, he was able to bring his army across and then take or commandeer every boat in the Delaware River for miles, forcing the British to set up camp on the other side. Washington then, in a daring move on Christmas Day, was able to cross the Delaware River in the middle of the night and coordinate 4 or 5 different armies to descend on Trenton, New Jersey, where he ambushed a group of Germans who were not expecting to see him, and were able to drive the Germans off, winning a battle or a victory that was desperately needed for morale. He then was able to fight the Battle of Princeton, which allowed him to attack the British baggage train and then get his army out of there before the majority of General Howe's army showed up, because, of course, fighting a large set-piece battle against the British army is not going to happen. And the Battle of Princeton is noteworthy because this is one of Washington's almost suicidal feats of heroism, where in order to rally his flagging troops, he rode out in between the two lines, waving his hat and his coat to inspire the troops to fight on. And so he was able to capture part of the British baggage train and then get his troops out somewhat intact. So both of these battles demonstrate Washington's bravery and his strategic skill, and his army stays in the field, although they have to suffer a horrible winter in which they almost completely fall apart. The British were able to capture the city of Philadelphia more or less unopposed, as General Howe was able to march in, and Washington could do very little to stop him. And so the Continental Congress would flee from Philadelphia to the west, and they would continue meeting, of course. But the British now held the nation's capital, and so this is pretty unfortunate for the Americans, in that we've now lost two of our 3 biggest cities and really have no ability to actually defeat the British in the field. Washington's winter at Valley Forge was one of the moments where the American Revolution almost fell apart. Washington's men had nothing at Valley Forge. There were no shelter. There was very little food. They subsisted, when they could get it, on something called fire cakes, which is water combined with flour and heated up on a rock. And his men were more or less starving. Benjamin Franklin attempted to get supplies and was trying to broker some sort of European treaty. But at this point, with no major victories to speak of, no European power is going to formally back the United States. The French sent some back-channel weapons and things like that, but no one is going to actually come out for the Americans. What Franklin was able to do that was more important is he was able to convince some individual Europeans to come over. So, for example, the Marquis de Lafayette, a young liberal French noble, who was able to come over and help train the Americans because he was willing to work for no pay. And the Baron von Steuben was a Prussian military officer who was kicked out of the army of Prussia for being gay. And he came and helped drill the American troops until, after Valley Forge, Washington had a moderately effective fighting force, even if they were relatively hungry and undersupplied. The British then decide to retreat back to New York, and Washington gets a chance to try to use his new battle-trained army to fight a real set-piece battle against the British, trying to ambush them at Monmouth Courthouse here in New Jersey. The Battle of Monmouth represents the sort of one attempt that Washington had to win a set-piece battle, and unfortunately, it's foiled by a guy named Charles Lee. You can get this at the end of Right Hand Man. Oh, sorry. You can get this dramatized in the Hamilton song "Stay Alive," but needless to say, Charles Lee more or less betrays the Continental Army, and Washington is unable to capture the British, and the British escape. The Battle of Saratoga is often considered the turning point in the war. Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne's army is going to march down from Montreal with the idea that they're going to, once they meet up with General Howe's army in New York City, they'll have the numbers to just march around and crush any colonial resistance. But Burgoyne takes this weird overland route as opposed to sticking to the Hudson River, and he ends up getting trapped at a place called Saratoga. The colonists are able to fortify a hill next to the place where Burgoyne's army was camped, and over a 3-day battle, they end up surrounding and eventually defeating the British army. Burgoyne had attempted to break out from this American trap, but he was defeated, and his entire army surrendered. This is relevant for a couple different reasons. One, of course, because it takes one of the British armies off the board, which is a huge deal. But secondarily, this helps broker an alliance with France because the French start to think that we might actually have a chance to win this war, and so the French then throw their whole weight on the side of the Americans, sending, of course, over a navy and an army and a bunch more supplies. So the French alliance is one of the keys to American victory in the War for Independence, and it's brokered almost completely because of the success at the Battle of Saratoga. The Battle of Saratoga is also important because it leads to Benedict Arnold's treason. He's probably the most famous traitor in American history. He was almost single-handedly responsible for both the victory at Ticonderoga and for rallying the troops at Saratoga, but he was not given credit for either of these accomplishments and was passed over for promotion because of intercolonial politics, in that we already had too many generals from Connecticut. So Benedict Arnold then attempted to betray the fortifications at West Point in New York, and he ended up being found out, and he fled just ahead of Washington's enforcers, who would have arrested and hanged him. He then joined the British side and perpetrated and led an army against the colonists. So that's the treason of Benedict Arnold in its briefest of forms. So, with the British making very little headway in the north, they ended up. General Clinton takes command of the war effort and sends his lieutenant Cornwallis to try to go down to the south, where they felt that there were more loyalists. And so the war moves southward, and Washington is going to be mostly sidelined until the very end, sitting outside the city of New York, but unable to actually take it. So the British move to the south, and they end up taking all of the important major cities. They also are hoping to start a slave uprising, but that never really materializes. And the British are able to first take the city of Charleston down here in South Carolina. And from there, they end up marching inland, more or less winning every battle, but continuing to get bled dry, because every time the British move into a new area, the colonial forces in that area are able to fortify their numbers with local militias, whereas the British regular troops just keep getting worn down. And so I'm not going to go into specific battles. There's some real interesting stuff here. Probably the most important battle is Guilford Courthouse, where the British win a Pyrrhic victory by taking huge numbers of casualties from American sharpshooters. And so every British soldier dead is one that they can't replace, whereas the American militias simply keep replenishing their numbers from the local population. The American most responsible for leading this effort is General Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, and Nathaniel Greene, who both lead contingents of irregular troops and are able to successfully bleed the British down. This brings us to the Battle of Yorktown. So, losing his numbers, Cornwallis needs to get back to the coast so he can hopefully get supplies from the British Navy, and he sets up a base at Yorktown up on a peninsula in Virginia. This allows Virginia this strategic blunder allows the French Navy to drive the British Navy off and to blockade Yorktown from the sea, where Washington does a speed march down from Philadelphia and is able to surround Yorktown from the land. And so now the British troops are trapped in this town of Yorktown, and it's just a matter of digging trenches and then digging closer trenches and then digging closer trenches. And then as the British are running low on supplies, the colonists launch a massive assault. This is the Hamilton track, the world turned upside down, if you're following along. And the British surrender, taking the second British army off the board. It's important to note that the British still held New York City and probably could have fought on if they wanted to, but having lost two armies and being in massive amounts of debt, in the end, they're able to negotiate a ceasefire, and we dispatch agents to England to negotiate a truce and hopefully a formal treaty. And so, with the Battle of Yorktown, the war comes to an end, and the colonies are probably independent. We still need to sort of negotiate that out. But the war itself ends, and we'll start tomorrow by talking about the Peace of Paris. So here are your objectives. Make sure you can answer these in a substantive way, and we'll be back tomorrow to continue the story of the American Revolution.